Hello and welcome to this video lecture for Introduction to Philosophy. And today we're going to be talking about Native American ethics. So we want to make a number of distinctions to make sure that we properly contrast it with a kind of individualist ethic or a kind of ethic of individualist societies. And we kind of get into some of the differences between what characterizes an ethic of more individualist societies and what characterizes an ethic of more collectivist societies like Native American culture. So we'll see there's a number of distinctions and points that Cordova makes here to help us get a sense of how this idea of ethics is different from other versions. So we want to get an understanding of some of the main concepts in this video. So just to start off with thinking about what it means to live in an individualistic culture. So individualism prioritizes things like natural rights, independence and self-interest, everybody acting so as to look after their own self-interest. It tends to celebrate difference, uniqueness and individual differences between people. So individualism places importance on autonomy, rights and freedom, believe that each person possesses inherent value and is entitled to make independent choices. It recognizes personal responsibility and the unique qualities and contributions of each individual to society. And of course, each individual is supposed to find their own way to contribute in a way that they can sort of serve their own self-interest and thereby contribute to society and earn their livelihood as well. So an individualistic culture will celebrate self-expression and will kind of emphasize the idea of self-expression and uniqueness in parenting as well, and will embrace the idea of self-reliance, individuals taking responsibility for their own actions. So these are the kind of typical ideas that we find in an individualistic culture. Now we can compare this to a collectivistic culture, and as we'll see, there are elements here that reflect the presuppositions of Native American ethics. It seems to have more of a sort of collectivist orientation than an individualistic orientation. So collectivism usually refers to a situation where it's the group that has priority over individual preferences. So group values function as guidance and evaluation criteria for personal achievements and actions. There's a much closer relationship between individual identity and group identity and our sort of sense of belonging to the collective and drawing our sort of motivations and guidance and evaluations from the collective. So in a collective culture, it's collective or communal needs that hold higher value, responsibility to others, and we'll see that as well reflected in Native American conception of ethics. So the kind of deviance from norms and adulation of individual heroes is seen with skepticism, and I think that's something we can contrast quite strongly with individualistic culture. And in individualistic culture, it's the deviance from norms and adulation of individual success is celebrated. The kind of typical sort of heroes in the West, in sort of individualistic Western countries, are heroes who kind of go against the norm and achieve some kind of higher insight by going against their society. So there's a lot of classic examples of that from fiction and science fiction, where that sort of where there's this kind of this sort of celebration of individuals sort of breaking out of the norm or breaking out of the sort of social context in order to kind of achieve something significant. So a collectivist culture is allegedly common in non-Western nations such as Indonesia and China. We might find more features of a collectivist culture in those places. Obviously, we find features of an individualistic culture in Western nations like the United States, the UK, and Australia, and so on. So we can see different responses in the kind of different responses of these cultures to things like COVID. Whereas collectivist cultures are much more willing and able to impose social restrictions when there's a sort of pandemic emergency and you have to isolate people. Collectivist cultures are much more sort of comfortable putting those restrictions on individual conduct and sort of setting out restrictions, quite severe restrictions in terms of quarantining, separating, and so on. When you leave the country, when you come back into the country, you're supposed to quarantine and so on. So that's much easier in a collectivist culture where the sort of preference for collective needs is held in high esteem. As we know, it was much harder to do that in the United States and other individualistic countries where there was a lot of opposition to kind of mandates that about schools and when restaurants and so on could be open. So individualistic cultures are much less willing to have those sort of restrictions placed on them because of communal needs. We might think of climate change as well, where we see sort of individualistic cultures, Western nations pursuing kind of individualistic solutions, the kind of carbon pricing and that kind of thing, rather than pursuing sort of collectivist solutions, which would sort of place more of a burden on, more of a sort of barrier on individual choice and more of a sort of block on things that individuals couldn't do. So those are some, I think, clear differences between collectivist and individualistic cultures. So we find in Native American ethics, as Cordova says, that ethics is based on the fact that human beings exist in social environments. So I think this tells us about the collectivist orientation of Native American ethics, that it's the social environment that comes first and the human beings existing in a social context that takes precedence. And Cordova makes this claim that indigenous Americans, similar to the Greeks, in fact, found their codes of conduct on the premise that human beings are naturally social beings. So in contrast to the Greeks, however, there's this emphasis that the Native American idea is founded on the idea of equality. So as well as being social beings, it doesn't set up a hierarchy, but it promotes an emphasis on consensual decision making. So native ethics involves a rejection of hierarchical systems. The kind of hierarchical sort of thinking was was sort of common in the Greek world, reflecting the sort of hierarchical social structure. And Cordova is making the claim that that's not the case in Native American ethics, but they still sort of hold this premise about human beings being naturally social beings. So it's within the social context, that's where we have to sort of look to find guidance about ethics. So in contrast to that, a very common Western idea of thinking about ethics and commitment is through the idea of the social contract. And the social contract is an act by which individuals agree to form a government. So there's allegedly a sort of state pre-existing the situation in which individuals come together to form a government. We call that the state of nature in social contract theorists. So governments are established by the people who combine to achieve some goal. And it's like coming together to write a contract and agreeing to our mutual responsibilities and obligations and so on. And that's the sort of formula that we can find in Hobbes and Locke and in a different form in Rousseau as well. So the idea is there's a state of nature prior to any government in which individuals are able to sort of exercise their self-interest. But because of some of the difficulties, the inconveniences, as Locke says, of that state, individuals come together to form a contract, and institute a government. So this is a typical sort of Western idea where it's the state of nature, the kind of separation of human beings that is the natural state, in which we're all in a state of hostility or conflict or war, or at least lack of a superior authority in this state. So this is a state in which we're not related to other people in other than in ways that serve our self-interest, and we're seen as driven by our self-interest to sort of look after our own needs. And it's only the kind of inconveniences of this state that lead us to set up a government with others. So it's not like we have the social contract tradition doesn't suggest that we have a natural kind of need for social contact with other people, that we have this natural need for social intercourse. It's more like something that happens because of the inconveniences of our kind of natural state of independence. Now, in contrast to the social contract tradition, Cordova emphasizes this idea of internalization. And internalization of rules or internalization of norms as being the sort of thing that sets the social context in motion. So often internalization is described in sociology as a form of social control, and the idea is that internalization of rules is a means of sort of teaching social behavior used by those who subscribe to the sense of the human being as a we. That's how Cordova describes it. So internalization is an opposite conception to the kind of individualist social contract view. In the view of internalization, we sort of take on norms into ourselves, and then we become able to follow them without any kind of sanction or without being observed by any kind of social authority, as though it's natural for us to sort of put these norms into practice. So when people come to believe that a particular norm is good, useful, and appropriate, they generally follow it and expect others to do the same. They do this because they have internalized the norm. So it becomes part of an individual's personality, conditioning them to conform to society's expectations. So that's the sense in which it's sometimes described as a form of social control. Now, the alternative to internalization in terms of social control is sanction. In other words, punishment through law or other kinds of sanction. So the sanction is a kind of external thing. It works by pressuring our behavior and pressuring us to conform because we don't want the negative consequences of the sanction. Internalization is different. It's as though we sort of take on the norm within ourselves, and it becomes kind of natural to us to put it into practice as though it's a norm that we ourselves endorse. So the two assumptions here are that human beings are social beings by nature, and that they want to remain in the social group. And those are the assumptions that allow for the idea of internalization. So when we internalize norms, they become sort of part of who we are. They become part of how we think about ourselves and our relation to others. Now, Cordova also stresses this idea that that Native American sees him or herself as part of the natural life process through which all things on Earth come to exist. So this means there are ethical obligations towards the Earth as a whole and its capacity to sustain life. And again, this might be very different to, to an individualist ethic where there are no obligations to the life process until it becomes restraining. In other words, until it becomes imperative to do so to continue to sort of function and live and so on. But from the Native American point of view, we're already part of the natural life process. And so respecting it and being able to see ourselves as having ethical obligations towards that process and towards the earth is something that should be sort of natural to us anyway, and shouldn't depend on a kind of crisis to draw out those sort of impulses about protecting the natural environment. So there's a very different conception of dependence here. We talked about the dependence on the social order, and there's also this sense of dependence on the earth and the universe. Now, in terms of ethical learning, Cordova makes the point that, and this is a quote from page 178, the primary lesson that is taught is that the individual's actions have consequences for himself, for others, for the world. So those are the sort of three sort of elements: the self, society, and the world. So we're always sort of caught up, imbricated in these relationships. We can't sort of extricate ourselves from these relationships to others and the world as a whole, through which we become ethical people. The newcomer's humanness is measured according to how he comes to recognize that his actions have consequences for others, for the world. Now, there's a difference from Hashi here, in that for Hashi we're sort of born human, we're sort of born in the image of God, I guess we would say. And here there's an idea that we only become human through these communal relationships, that it's through these relationships that we learn our place in relation to others. So becoming human is a process, and it's something that takes place in society through sort of learning our place in relation to others. So it's when you come to recognize your place as a member of the group that you achieve full humanness. So we're not born being fully human, and that's a perspective that we saw in Malefi as well in African ethics, that humanness is something we develop through how we sort of integrate ourselves into the group, into the family, into the community, into the wider group, and so on. So it's something that takes place over time. So Cordova gives us this analogy. He says that in a Native American ethical system, the actions of the individual are like the pebble dropped into the pond. So the idea here obviously is the ripples that extend out from an individual act and keep extending out as far as we can see. So actions affect others in all kinds of ways. And it's the awareness of that, the awareness of how our actions potentially might affect others, that's the key to ethics. So it's a kind of analogy for the individual and the community, where everything we do creates these ripples, creates these communal effects. And the point of our action is to sort of be able to see these effects, to be able to sort of produce the right ones. So comparing this to the individualist American way of thinking, where Cordova says we would see ourselves as kind of human beings, as people aboard a ship on a vast sea. But as long as we're sort of on the ship, we don't notice or really care about the ripples. They just extend away from the boat to infinity, but they don't kind of affect us. And he uses that to illustrate this kind of this individualist way of thinking, where we kind of cut off from the consequences of the things we do. We kind of cut off from the consequences of our actions. And from a Native American perspective, we have to see ourselves as in the middle of those ripples, in the middle of all the consequences and the effects and the outcomes that come from the thing we do. So we can't sort of isolate ourselves from what happens when we act. All right, so we've talked today about the the difference between an individualist and a collectivist culture, and we've seen some of the ways those differences play out in terms of how individuals see themselves in terms of pursuing self-interest or sort of contextualized in social relationships. We talked about Native American ethics being based on the we, the idea of being part of the community as the thing that sets our obligations and duties. So that's the thing that comes first, before we kind of have a conception of ourselves as individuals. And we always have a conception of ourselves as individuals in relation to the we, in relation to the group. And we saw that's very different to the sort of very common social contract idea in Western thinking about ethics, where we're sort of individualist first, and then we come together to form society based on our individual interests. That's a very different idea to the Native American idea of the priority of the we. And we talked about the idea of dependence on the community and on the earth as a whole. And again, the sort of difference that makes for this idea of ethics in comparison to more individualistic understandings.